With the imminent start of a new administration in Washington, this is the perfect time to consider the role of spirituality in presidential decision-making. No, I'm not talking about Nancy Reagan seeking advice from astrologers, or Hillary Clinton holding conversations with the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt in a non-seance seance. Instead, I'm talking about how faith leaders gain backdoor access to our presidents. First of all, let me say that every president has the right to bring whomever they want to into their sphere of decision-making. Big business gangsters, prostitutes, soothsayers, and evangelical prayer makers alike. What troubles me, though, is that in our recent history, president after president has felt a need to rely on spiritual advice, potentially at the expense of a far better alternative. Now let's step back a bit. What should a fair and competent leader do when faced with a hard decision? Split a virgin lamb's guts out on a rock? Spin a bottle? Read the polls? Consult with non-experts about what they think? A fair and competent leader comes to a decision by first appreciating the diverse values at stake for the array of stakeholders, then developing various alternatives, then using the best available knowledge about what different decisions will lead to based on good intelligence, good science, and expert opinion. He or she, the decision maker, weighs the values and the likely effects, and then decides what to do. A weak and partisan leader comes to such hard decisions in a very different and much simpler way. First, he decides on the preferred outcome. Then he selectively uses intelligence, science, and experts to justify that decision. Lost by this approach are the values and concerns of minority stakeholders. Lost are the expert voices of disagreement that could allow for formulation of better, more balanced options. Lost is the diversity of intelligence and science which tempers the certainty of expected outcomes. In this latter approach to decision-making, those who gain the ear of the president can unduly influence outcomes more than is likely in the preferred, more structured approach that comes from decision science. Okay, so right about now you're wondering, why am I talking about decision science instead of Billy Graham? It's because for decades, when faced with hard decisions, the presidents we've been electing feel a need to ask for guidance from the spiritual world. From that great fountain of omniscient knowledge called Jesus, called God, and for decades, Billy Graham, spiritual advisor to presidents, has served as a medium toward that end. Having recently passed his 90th birthday, the political life of the evangelist Billy Graham is now behind him, but it's likely that many future presidents will continue to resort to prayer and seek guidance from religious leaders when faced with tough decisions. Billy Graham was born on a farm near Charlotte, North Carolina in 1918, and at the age of 16 he was converted by a traveling evangelist. After high school he attended several religious schools and refined his preaching style using the birds and stumps of the field. By 1943 he accepted the Bible as the infallible word of his God, and he soon preached his view of life and salvation to tent-filled masses across the country and world. Through the Cold War of the 1950s, he became a national figure, largely due to the special support of his most important early admirer, that anti-communist news mogul William Randolph Hearst. A key to his national recognition was that Billy translated his spiritual beliefs into actions that mattered on the broader political stage. To his credit, he refused to speak to segregated congregations when much of society expected it. He became the first important evangelist to speak behind the Iron Curtain, giving an important international voice to that great American value called religious freedom. In South Africa, he famously denounced apartheid 17 years before it was to end, thereby strengthening the international resolve that eventually ended it. Unlike most evangelicals of the past and present, Billy became a moral authority in a relatively nonpartisan way. This eventually allowed him to acquire the unusual role of pastor to the presidents. Remarkably, he has met with every sitting U.S. president since Harry Truman. Early on, Billy learned to not talk openly about his conversations with the presidents, so we really don't know as much as we'd like to about his influence, and more importantly, how our religious presidents actually make hard decisions. But talk about the potential for influence, though. Billy Graham spent the last day of Johnson's presidency in the White House, and he was there to greet Nixon the next day. He led private church services in the White House for President Nixon, and Nixon countered by speaking at a Billy Graham revival in Tennessee in 1970. In 1990, he stayed overnight at the White House before George Herbert Walker Bush initiated the first Gulf War. Now one can imagine any president talking to Billy about the mind-numbing burden of decisions that will kill people and permanently ruin the lives of millions. Billy, will innocent Muslim Iraqi women and children that are air-bombed ever get to heaven? Billy, does God's commandment, thou shalt not kill, refer to an undeclared war? Billy, what does God say about gays in the military? Billy, my advisors disagree on health care. What would Jesus do? Billy, I need God's help to decide what I lack the strength to do on my own. In these recurrent moments of intimacy, did Billy's presence simply affirm the president's pre-existing values and decisions, or were any of the last 11 presidents ever swayed by what Billy Graham had to say? Did Billy voice the expert opinion of God, or rather, did he offer his advice as his personal opinion? I hold that secretive religious sessions with presidents really matter, because advice too easily comes across as the expert opinion of God, not as the voice of special interest. And in real terms, it matters because Cold War tensions may have been escalated by evangelical influence in Middle East politics. Was this in our best interest? It matters because Billy was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War, which killed millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of young Americans. Was it unduly prolonged? It matters because in the 1990s, Billy called AIDS a probable judgment from God. Did his prejudicial, non-scientific beliefs influence public health policy? It matters because the creationist beliefs of evangelists like Billy Graham are a threat to the integrity of science. How useful could the advice be from someone who even today sponsors workshops led by Ken Ham? It matters because political decisions should never be tainted by the concept of inerrancy, that knowledge or decisions just can't be or go wrong. My friends, it matters because the best advisor to the president should be someone who understands the diversity of values at stake, not just a prejudiciously short list of values. It matters because the best advisor to the president should be someone who understands the possible consequences and uncertainties of all options, not someone who puts faith first. And it matters because the best decisions are simply made using a transparent and replicable process, not from unreliable reliance on prayers to any and all invisible higher authorities that very well may not have the best interests of the electorate, the country, or the world at heart.